Well, that was the nicest introduction I've ever been given. Thank you so much, my new best friend. I am acutely aware that I live on both sides of the things that we've been discussing today. At the Pew Research Center, we study this stuff, and so we are using all sorts of new kinds of data and new analytical techniques to explain the world in the way that Pew used to do, almost exclusively with telephone surveys. So it's that part of our life. We're always thinking about how to apply the things that we're talking about today to the research we're doing. But the other thing we do is that we eat our own dog food. We have to study how this stuff happens because we have to live in the world of ideas, the marketplace of ideas. So we have to use promotional techniques and interventions and messaging schemes that are also part of the conversation today. So I'm feeling very bipolar at the moment. And luckily, I don't have to act on any of that because you heard Don describe me as working for a place that self-describes as a fact tank. We do that intentionally to distinguish ourselves from another part of the Washington bestiary, think tanks, which are in a really different line of work from the work that we pursue. Think tanks are very much doing advocacy. They are really smart, well-schooled, highly intentioned people who see problems in the world and they try to come up with solutions to those problems and aggressively promote those solutions. At the Pew Research Center, the water's edge for us is advocacy. We do not do any advocacy. I would be fired if any of you tweeted that I had a personal opinion coming out of today. As a matter of fact, it's really interesting that there aren't many tweets coming out of these sessions, so that's good. I can maybe be more candid than I might otherwise be. We are supposed to do, though, really strong social science work in the hopes that people like you will be interested in it. We do it so that we can be a level set on sort of what's going on in the world. We can be a reality check on some of the echo chambers that all of us live in, including you folks. But we don't do it with a point of view. So I'm not funded to be a cheerleader for the internet. I'm not funded. We do a lot of research about libraries. I'm not funded to be a cheerleader for librarians. We follow the data, and if I had lousy things to say about the internet or lousy things to say about libraries, we report them too. But we do that mostly in the spirit that you guys will be smart enough to figure out how these data maybe apply to you. And you heard Don say that I came up through the print media business. I first worked for a daily newspaper and then for a printed magazine back in the day, and I remember the systems that we used to try to judge whether we were making a mark in the world or not. And the Simmons, I don't know if you remember this, I'm the oldest one in the room, clearly, but they had a logo recognition test for measuring the readership of magazines. So circulation numbers were, a standard metric and things like that, but you really wanted to find out what the readership levels were, and so they put people in a room and they flashed magazine logos at them every 3 or 4 or 5 seconds and say, do you recognize it? Do you think you might have read anything from a place like this in whatever time frame mattered to us? And that's how we went out to the world and sold our stuff to advertisers. And it really was a world that no matter what schemes were being used and what media properties and platforms were being used, it was a system of recording what people thought and said they did rather than actually what they did. It was recognition was a core metric. If you recognize something that was meant to be a substitute for a lot deeper engagement than it actually was supposed to be. If you could recall something, awesome, because that was another way that somehow you'd had an impact, and we imputed way more power to that impact than probably was worth the effort. There was reporting, of course, in the diary system of Nielsen and other stuff like that. And then remembered behavior was also, it's a mystery in many cases, and things that people don't really recall very well, but that was meant to substitute for these gigantic numbers that we handed over to advertisers and said, see, we're worth the buy because we reach all these people in all of these special ways. Well, now we've moved into a world that we've documented pretty well. One of the unintended benefits of working at the Pew Research Center and the ways that we have is the government has largely stepped out of the business of doing ongoing tracking of technology adoption in media. It used to be housed, and as a matter of fact still is housed, in a division of the Commerce Department. But especially during the first decade of this century, the government didn't do much work in this. So the Pew Research Center, in fact, became the de facto census bureau for lots of the basic statistics about who is an internet user, who was using broadband, the rise of mobile connectivity, and the rise of social media. So these are our latest data in the chart here on the right. A lot of people have cell phones. A lot of people use the internet. 77%, so 3/4 of American adults, these are adult numbers, not all Americans, but adult numbers, 77% use smartphones, 69% use some kind of social media. We ask a generic social media question, and then we ask about specific platforms. We just have started treating YouTube as a social media platform, so 76% of Americans use YouTube, so that number is actually higher if you add those people into it. And it was an awkward moment because we are not supposed to do market research. One of the most important things about Pew is there are plenty of people who do awesome proprietary research about particular brands, particular platforms, and the things that they do. We didn't want to be in that business, but it became really awkward, especially in the early days of Twitter, to talk to people about the thing we called microblogging. No, we didn't get accurate answers on this, so we had to ask, do you use Twitter? And so that's why we began to ask about specific platforms. We began to ask about Snapchat, of course, when it became a substitute platform, not a substitute, but an amplification platform for teenagers and young adults who hated it on Facebook when their parents wanted to friend them and their grandparents wanted to friend them. So Snapchat, the rise of Snapchat, which we have documented very thoroughly, especially in a new report, about 3/4 of young adults age 18 to 24 are Snapchat users. It's off the charts, and they're doing it because they're not under the watchful gaze of their parents, their bosses, and folks that they don't want to see. But the rise of all of this stuff and the ways in which it has shaped life are astounding. For your purposes, I've listed some of the more powerful impacts. First of all, it shifted the way people use their time. And really, in a way, that's what you're measuring, is how people allocate their time and attention. And in a way, the internet has expanded the equation in both directions. There are lots of ways now that you folks have already been describing in the wonderful sessions this morning and later on this afternoon. We can get real-time information. We don't have to wait for that Nielsen report to come out or that Simmons monthly circulation number to come out or something like that. You can see in real time what's happening and monitor what's going on, but it also goes into an enormous database that's searchable. And the power of both directions of that equation is just astounding. And now what you can really see about what people are doing and how to get feedback out and how to respond to it. It is now a media environment that is place agnostic. We used to have a thing called appointment media. We still have a little bit of it now, but it's not, people's media behavior is not beholden to when the newspaper lands on the front step or when the TV show is on at night or when it's the top of the hour to get a newscast from a radio station. People are running their own playlists in their own time, in their own way, which has been enormously disruptive to all those metrics from the past. It's highly socially orchestrated now. So the pathway that people learn about stuff is really different in many cases from the way that their parents and their grandparents used to learn about things. It's often through their friends and through their social networks that people become aware of things. It's standard issue media, it's old school media, as well as some of the newer inventive stuff. But social pathways to information are now preeminent in many respects and how people are getting information. It's obviously enabled multitasking, so one of the really hard things to figure out is what exactly people are paying attention to when they've got multiple devices or multiple screens or multiple accounts literally live and open in front of them. And it also makes people's distractions a little bit more obvious, but also harder to figure out the meaning of them, particularly for the sense of their use of media. It's linked in multi-platform. So I'll show you a slide in the next slide. We'll talk about the ways in which people are doing lots of stuff in lots of different ways. So the complexity in the environment, think about your own communications patterns. I mean, as you have something to say to someone, You have to think about what you want to say, what's the best way to get their attention, how big or small you want the audience to be, and when are they likely to engage with it. Because if you want a real-time answer, you'll use a different mechanism to connect with them than you would if you want to be asynchronous. You're just throwing a question out into the universe and getting a response whenever your audience wants to respond to it. So there are ways now that this is more complicated, and the way that people think about communication and media is more complicated. It's increasingly politicized. I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but politics infects a lot of things in this culture that it didn't used to infect. As a matter of fact, when we do analysis of the most important predictors of someone's engagement with lots of communication and media now, partisanship and ideology now vastly, I was going to say Trump, but vastly are the most important elements that are screens through which people pass information. It's much more important than the stuff that used to anchor social science, like their education level, like their race and ethnicity, right? Like their age, like their religious affiliation. Their partisan views are now 3 to 4 times more likely to be the thing through which they evaluate information than any of those other classic measures of democracy. And it's increasingly gamified, both in the sense that you can figure out how people are using it and use those feedback loops to get more of it, but it also can be gamed by the people who used to be called the audience, right? They can figure out how to mess with your analytics. We're going to put out a report tomorrow at the Pew Research Center about the role of bots in the Twitter sphere and how they promote content in links. So it's not all Twitter content. It's an astounding number. I'm not going to step on our lead tomorrow, but stay tuned and help our traffic metrics tomorrow. So what all of this adds up to is that media now is essentially a body part and a body enhancer. I mean, in the age when we're moving towards having our own personal agents do some of our work for us, some of our business for us, some of our media acquisition for us, there are ways in which our bodies are sort of running around the virtual space without us attached to them. And it means that media is pervasive, persistent, searchable, and spreadable. The whole character of information and media has changed in this world. Here are the numbers that show some of the complexity that we capture we don't ask about every media platform, social media platform specifically, but you can just see the median American now, more than half of Americans use at least 3 of the platforms that we've asked about here. And I suspect if we broke this down and asked about a lot more platforms, the number would be in double digits for 20-somethings. The millennials and now the new post-millennials. So there are ways in which, again, sort of how these platforms interact with each other, how they're segregated in people's minds for doing different purposes, capturing different kinds of information in media is a big part of the story. Here's data that Pew cares a lot about news. And so this mostly applies to sort of metrics related to news, but my guess is that if you asked more about entertainment products or sort of generalized enrichment products or about medical information or about civic information or any of that stuff, these numbers wouldn't be much off from that reality. So on the left here, 2/3 of adults now get news from social media. That's a number that gets quoted a lot. We're the sort of gold standard number on that. We only have sort of 2 solid readings on it, and it grew a little bit from 2016 to 2017. The bubbles in the middle show that as a proportion of the audience of that platform, how many people regularly get news from that platform. So you'll see that Twitter is particularly high. 11% of all Americans and 15% of all Americans use Twitter. 11% of those Twitter users, 11% of the Americans are Twitter users get news out of there. So the news has a sort of different place and a different standing in different platforms, and I don't think we really know yet the full story on YouTube, in part because I think our definition of news might be a little too traditional and a little too crimped, but probably the rise of YouTube as now a sort of news and information source is growing. And then there's this amazing number, about 25% Americans get news from multiple social media platforms. Again, it speaks to this notion that the news is coming at people in a lot of different directions. Sometimes intentionally on their part, they're looking for news. A lot of times it's unintentionally. And one of the sort of interesting new mindsets we haven't got data on this, but I think it's supported by circumstantial evidence. One of the ways that people think about news now, and probably related to entertainment as well, is I don't necessarily have to be too vigilant about paying attention to what's going on, because if it matters to the people around me and to the world around me, it will eventually find its way to me. And that's a really different thing from you having to be sort of sitting there constantly with, like a phased array radar looking for what's going on and assuming that somehow your network and your buddies and the media properties that you care about are going to give you what you need. There's been a rapid growth of mobile connection to news. I think this has got to apply across the board now, but it was a big jump from 2013 to 2016. And when people have multiple devices, or when they have choices, or when they have access, majority of them will get something on mobile rather than getting something on a desktop or a laptop. Here, we haven't really tried a lot to do cord-cutting numbers because it does seem sort of into that zone of market research, and we're not quite about that. But we do ask people about what's the primary way they get television, and the number to highlight there is the 61% of young adults who say that it comes from online streaming services. And it's not entirely clear whether they're answering about their DVRs in that answer, but it's still striking that, again, this sense of especially broadcast television being an appointment medium has completely been thrown to the wind by a younger generation. And here's the partisan story with media, again, very directly related to news, but it speaks to the ways in which political information and people's judgment about the politicization of information, it shows up in people's lives. So we ask, consistent liberals and consistent conservatives are people who we ask a series of value questions, and we score we score them on a liberal to conservative scale. And if you're almost entirely liberal, you fit in that bucket. If you're almost entirely conservative. So this isn't everybody. But the people who are most active in our culture, the most politically active, the most media attuned and stuff like that, they have different media universes. It's not, echo chambers isn't quite the right way to understand it, but they certainly have media preferences that play out in their media diet. So consistent liberals go to what some folks would say are sort of conventional mainstream media sites, and Fox News is clearly, this was in 2014, and there's an interesting sort of rise of more conservative media that now doesn't rival Fox, but it's now showing up in some data that are related to this. Then we ask about trust in media sources. Horrible, hard box to read. I wish we'd done a better job of this. The only thing to know is the different pattern of boxes in this chart, which is about trust. Which sources do you trust? And you can see that liberals and conservatives just allocate their trust in news media in way different ways. And some people don't trust anybody, and that's a reality now. So even as media properties, in some cases, are trying not too much to be considered partisan in one way, shape, or another, clearly their audiences see them that way, and as I say, that's a main filter through which they judge a lot of media stuff. And then here's our little happy grid of how people are consuming media in all kinds of ways and all kinds of platforms. There's enormous overlap between sources of news and sort of different ways that people are using social media. Again, way too dense graphic, but I thought I'd show that to you. So this world has produced what I consider to be 5 new kinds of media zones. The classic media zones, I would say, are sort of engaged. You're reading the newspaper, or you're watching the movie, or you're watching TV or something like that. There are now sort of 5 new ways in which people sort of think about and act in media spaces when they're allocating their attention, and another one's on the way. So just to make sure there's a BEA for years to come, I'm going to give you a cause for thinking of that. One I call signals. It's basically people who have set up alerts on their phones or in other ways. Sometimes they don't necessarily live or die on their phones, but the phone is the main instrument for this, and say, tell me when something happens in the universe related to these subjects that I care about. And it's not just news. It can be changes in the stock market. It can be changes in your social media environment or things like that. But people who live on alert are basically saying to the media sphere, I'm all in, I want to know, and you guys are the my trusted arbiters to feed me that information. So it's people who have already said, first of all, I trust brands. This is a real sort of brand restoration mechanism that didn't exist in the days when the web and sort of desktop experiences were the exclusive way, and people were sort of surfing and browsing all over the place. In an alert environment, you're saying, I like this brand to tell me this stuff because I trust them to do that. But it's essentially saying, I want real-time awareness of these things that I've told you about. It's anchored in headlines and new information, and in this environment, first impressions matter a lot. So you not only have to be a trusted institution to get the sort of app or the alert loaded in the first place, but people are instantly judging whether the information you're feeding them in that moment bears more scrutiny or not. And that's why I say engagement can be just glancing. I mean, people are scrolling through their alerts relatively quickly, or it can be galvanizing. If it's a major thing, and the thing that they have announced they want to be alerted about, all of a sudden they are down the attention hole into that thing that matters most to them. And I'm guessing at the allocation of media time that people have here, nobody can get the time metrics on this, but I'm thinking that it's an episodic thing. People will glance at their phones if they get a buzz or a bang or something like that, or they get a break as they're walking to a meeting. But in the overall allocation of their day-to-day, week-to-week media stuff, it's probably not that much. And brands are sort of central to that experience. The second group I call snacking. There's a wonderful long essay written by a guy named William Dereshowitz, who now teaches in the Cultural Studies Department at Yale, saying basically, we've lost our aptitude for boredom. If you are bored in today's modern culture, you just have no excuse, because there is no possible way that you can't be entertaining yourself, even when you've got the littlest, tiniest increment of time on your hands. So the snacking environment is literally when people are waiting for stuff to happen, or in between things, or don't have a lot of time to allocate to things. They're in line at the grocery store. They're waiting at a red light. They're waiting for the keynote speaker to talk, or something like that. And it's a way just literally to dose yourself with something that matters to you. So it's a killing time, beating boredom kind of activity. You've got your favorite things that you do when you've got some downtime. What's interesting, I'm guessing here, is that everybody does this in some way. They do different things for different reasons, but the demographics of this probably aren't determinative, and I wouldn't worry about them too much. Engagement is kind of distracted. The meeting's about to begin, the light's about to turn green or something like that. And the quality of people's social networks matters a lot in how much they're focused on this stuff. If they've got neat buddies who keep sharing great stuff with them, they're more likely to be snacking regularly than folks who think their networks are not too awesome or things like that. The third group I call social streams, and this is kind of an interesting one, and to some degree the most challenging one, because it's literally when you have a longer increment than that little snacking time, you sort of dive into the stream, or you put your dipper into the stream and you take what's there. And so it's really hard for media planners, for instance, to figure out when's the moment I can get this message to someone, because there are predictable patterns to when people are in social streams or not. They're more likely to do it at lunchtime. They're more likely to do it in the evening. But it's not like you can sort of predict to the moment when your stuff will actually register on their screen, much less register in their brain. But the content here, the motive is catching up, checking in, and curiosity. So FOMO is a little bit of this, but it's more just generally, I want to see what's going on, in part because it's so anchored in social media experiences. Content is news in the broadest sense. News, what's going on with my neighbor. News, what's happened to the stock market. News, are we going to war with Korea? It's just however people define it, that's what they're doing when they're in the social streams. And the engagement level is sort of varied. I use the wonderful Linda Stone term, continuous partial attention, to describe how people are in this space. They're kind of there, they're kind of not. And it's a horrible state to be in, because you don't retain stuff really well, and you feel crappy because you're not doing something more meaningful with your life. So I don't know, but there's a lot of it going on. it's horizontal scanning, so people are scrolling through stuff and pausing on things that sort of make meaning to them, but think of it as headline browsing in the broad sense of headlines. The influentials in this are editors and social networks. So editors are the curators of great stuff that people might want to be interested in, and again, sort of social networks are the mediators for lots of this information getting there. And I'm guessing it's a pretty significant amount of people's times, in part because it's often combined with this. It's split screen behavior. So they're sometimes watching what's going on one screen and sometimes sort of having half an eye on that and half an eye on the small screen or the other screen that's in their vicinity. Split screen behavior is very common in big social events. Think about all those people who are tweeting during the Super Bowl or the last episode of Breaking Bad or whatever. But it's a way in which interestingly, the culture comes together, and the social description of it and the social meaning making from it are actually quite active because people are posting about it and reading what their friends have to say about it and stuff like that. So it is time sensitive, and it is time anchored in a way that some of the other behaviors aren't. Split screen behavior is very often with an event plus social media. It's socially immersive, and the tone, I say snarky, it could be affirming, affectionate, altruistic, but not really. It's much more snarky, and in a way that is such a challenge for those who care about media analytics, because there aren't great AI programs for picking up sarcasm, right? And so if you're looking for keywords, that's not the world's best proxy for how much love, attention, affection, hate, whatever is going to that subject, because it's all bundled up together. And so we'll eventually get there, and the students in this room in particular are going to have tools available to them that will tell you snark positive, snark negative on the valence of information and stuff like that. And again, I think a lot of people spend a lot of time doing this in their typical day. Then there's this new thing. Actually, it's an older thing, but it's sort of, when you used to watch the long-running shows that had weekends that had similar programs on. What were those called? Marathons. Gosh darn it! I'm so sorry. And this is, in a way, this is expanding some of the longest running content of all. We now have story arcs that are multiple episodes long that have meaning. People love to sort of sit down and binge with them, and it's a completely immersive media experience. They don't want to be interrupted during this. They want all their other devices shut off, and they want to, and they're just anxious for the next weekend when the new round of new episodes of their favorite streaming service come on. And in an interesting way, this is restoring a major amount of influence over people's mind share to classic media properties, folks that know how to tell good stories, and now they've got a canvas that's much bigger than the canvases of the industrial age. So those are the 5 new media attention channels, and I think we're heading into this one. So you remember, I had to do Spreeville because I wanted to keep my S alliteration there going. So and now we're back to something that's realistic. Synthesized spaces where, like the Minority Report scene, where people themselves are manipulating data, and the data environment itself is feeding back to them in a useful way all of the, or lots of the stuff that is being collected on them. But the motive for being in there is people are setting their own permissions. And are allowing for some certain kinds of manipulations. It's very much oriented around personalized content, anticipatory and data infused. So there are lots of ways that the predicted you is very much a target of this synthesized environment, because they want you to think about the next thing or buy the next thing or something like that. It'll be upscale at first, because all technology adoption starts with upscale people first, but it'll eventually spread to the wider culture. But in an interesting way, there will be digital divides that emerge from this. So there will be people who are tech savvy enough, information savvy enough, to set their permissions and things like that, so that they can get what they want out of this space and not be hostage to it. And there will be people who will sort of not knowingly signed all their permissions away, be manipulated by algorithms and things like that, and will be essentially more victimized or certainly more steered in an environment like this, as opposed to people who are more in charge of their playlist and are at the other end of the digital divide. Analytics will be an enormous part of this, because we will be so deeply known. We can be projected to in ways that media creators have done that. And it'll essentially be, maybe not the end stage, but it will be a stage in which we're all media all the time. Really, data are our second skin already, right? We got the real stuff, and now data are so available to us that we can summon it anytime we want. It's sometimes, or often, pushed to us even when we don't want it and things like that. But this will be the sort of end stage of that, where essentially we are swimming in a sea of data and media that in some cases we can orchestrate, in other cases will be orchestrated around us. Oh man, that's ugly. Oh, I'm so sorry. Hold on. That's my money slide, too. So we will go like this. I am so sorry. Maybe you can read with me on this. My bad. Maybe you can read from this. There are new kinds of data in this environment. And I talk about cognitive behavior coming from browser and in-app behavior, coming from your search stream, so it's essentially your click stream and your search behavior, your permitted monitoring, so stuff that you've allowed to happen through permissions and things like that, through conversations and likes and shares. So now you are easily understood in a way that you didn't before, because people will literally watch you engaging with other people and other companies and stuff like that. And the new one that's sort of, it's not entirely clear how it will be integrated in this system, but smoke and commands, where the most astounding Pew number of the past 2 years, we asked the question once last fall, and 46% of Americans already use voice assistants in their lives. It's mostly a smart phone app-driven thing. It's not in freestanding Echoes and Google devices and stuff like that. But it's already a common interface for lots of folks, and they're comfortable with it for themselves. They're freaked out if their kids are in the household and their kids' speech might be monitored in some way, shape, or form. They're freaked out that they might be being listened to, even if they haven't summoned the device into their lives and stuff like that. But it's an enormously powerful way for the people who collect that voice data to understand how you navigate intimate spaces like your homes as well as your car and stuff like that. Location data are brand new in this environment. Your social graph and work history data, so it's not just Facebook, but it's LinkedIn. I mean, it's incredibly interesting to me how LinkedIn is now a default way for people sort of to announce themselves in their professional lives and to be willing to be contacted and willing to share lots of material about themselves and willing to join groups where they might not know a single other person other than the fact that they are organized around this job concept. And so there are ways in which those data are increasingly powerful in understanding how humans are. Obviously, we know specific time use patterns in a way we never could before about how people use media. Images and facial recognition are now just coming into the story, but you've probably heard about the apps that are now available that launch the camera in your phone and can read your facial expression and can send you a message of some kind saying, you look kind of hungry now. Do you want to go to the local store? You look kind of sad now. Would you like to take a little break and stuff like that? There are businesses built around that stuff now, and it's built around just images of you that have been fed into AI machines and machine learning algorithms, and they're coming out with that. Then there's the permission-granted monitoring I've already talked about. Extra surveillance data points. There was a strong comment early this morning saying, essentially, well, it's actually on the slide I'm going to present, and I won't have to say. We live our lives, according to my buddy Dana Boyd, a great media scholar, now where public is the default mode for us. You have to work hard to be private. Your public just by existing, and you're private by effort if you want to expend the effort and time on this. It's a brand new part of the human condition, and it's anchored in any number of the surveillance mechanisms that are there. And then I added this eighth one after this morning's discussion because I stupidly forgot. Biomedical information is now embedded in this stuff, and lots of data brokers have the capacity now to take your anonymized genomic information and add it into the many other rows of data that they've got about your cultural taste, your friendship networks, your job history, your medical condition, and actually one of the reasons I assume that Amazon bought Whole Foods and then began to form an insurance company is because when they see your grocery purchase behavior, they're going to figure out what some of your risks are or what some of your benefits are as they are making decisions about whether to insure you or not. The slide you can't see, doggone it, here is, I'll just go with this one. I forgot what the top one was, but there are imputed demographics. So this is about new tools that are available in this age. And imputed demographics is going to be one of the most interesting elements of this, and it's not just imputed classic demographics. We had a meeting with Google folks 6 years ago maybe, and we just regularly interact with them because we're in very much shared interest in some of the research questions we're asking. And they were telling us about they were going to roll out the sort of Google tells you who you are. You can log into Google and it'll tell you what Google thinks you are. It'll tell you the basic demographics, and then it will list your interests based on your browsing behavior. And you can change it if you want. And one of the things at this meeting that we went to, all of us, the minute we learned about this, we went and tried to figure out if Google understood us. And to a person, all the women in the room were furious because Google imputed them to be men. And the Google guy apologized and said, look, well, you can fix it. And so we're sorry to do that. But the fact of the matter is that your browsing behavior and your search behavior is kind of like an older man. So you work at Pew, right? You're really into news. You're really into technology, especially if you're working in our unit and stuff like that. So there's the signals, again, sort of stereotypical signals, but Google was sort of amassing them and sort of saying, the young women on our staff look like old men. And it was, and in a way, that's what they're selling to advertisers. They're not actually selling your actual gender and your age and stuff like that. They're selling your behavior that looks like sort of those conventional stereotypes and stuff. So there'll be my favorite two candidates for imputed demographics. One is social networks themselves. We will begin to put together people's social graphs and begin to judge how big their network is, how diverse their network is, how homophilous, how similar it is, how geographically dispersed it is. And there's just a ton of social science saying that the bigger and more diverse your network is, the way better off you are. And diversity by race and ethnicity for sure. If you've got friends from other races and ethnic groups, that's great. But also by age, by socioeconomic status, by a whole lot of other measures of diversity, having international friends not of your own country and stuff like that, you're wealthier. You get better jobs, as a rule. You're a way better citizen. By civic measures of well-being, the people who have big, diverse networks are much more active and engaged and more contributory to their communities. And so we now know that the composition of someone's network really matters to who they are. And so my guess is that we're going to eventually, in Google Analytics, get crosstabs about sort of network measurements and how how these people act this way because their network looks like this, and how people act the other way because their network looks like that. My second one, I'm guessing at. I'm not sure I'm right about this, but because it's so central to the conversation in our culture now about trust. And so people, trusters and non-trusters are way different people, and there are probably lots of tiers in between full trust and full distrust. But trust is a way now, is almost an anchor of identity. It's not just a judgment about, am I going to strike a deal or rely on the information with somebody or something. When people are telling us, particularly the non-trusters, that they don't trust government and media and the church and banks and big business and things like that, they're actually sort of stating a mindset, and they want to sort of give you every signal they possibly can about what team they're on. So it's not so much sort of how am I getting along with my fellow human beings, it's I want you to know I'm on this team. And so people think about trust probably in new ways, and my guess is that we'll get something that'll look like a demographic, strong variance by people's sort of levels of trust and willingness to trust and willingness to take risks. So those are my new demographics. You'll be able to do real-time dashboards and get readings on stuff. You'll get real-time experiments and testing and feedback. There are ways now that obviously analytics folks can do all sorts of feedback if they change the color on the website or they change the times of day that they message in certain kinds of ways. There will be lots of ways that these tools will give tremendously powerful signals about when to do stuff and when to avoid doing stuff. You'll get a lot of algorithmic sorting, processing, and predicting, so that in a way, the data that are being gathered are going to be turned into machine learning mechanisms so that you won't have to do the work, but that those are new tools that you'll be able to use to figure out where people are, particularly at the time you're thinking about getting a message to them. And then I added, after this morning's conversation, I added the Sims to this because there's tons of ways that you can do modeling off this and figure out what, under certain circumstances, people's predispositions can be. Sorry I left that slide up there for so long, but it was important points. So when you get to this point, you get the paradox of life, especially life in the data-drenched age. You get the quantified, more self-aware me, yay. You get the more predictable me. I'm not so sure that's yay. You get the empowered me. I can do more stuff. These tools give me the capacity to act more on my own. I don't have to depend on anybody to do a lot of the things I used to have to depend on people to do. But you get the monetized me. So there are ways in which, messaging, particularly commercial messaging, particularly when it's entertainment products, all of this stuff is good for business, good for advertisers, good for insight into particularly customized advertising. You get the self-sufficient me and the manipulated me. So to the degree that you're predictable in and of yourself, to the degree that you're predictable in the population that you're sorted into, you get the algorithms sort of steer you in certain directions. You get the solitary individual me and the widely exposed me. So again, the paradox of that. And you get the free agent me and the algorithmically boxed in me, which means that you guys have to be careful with this stuff because it's both things are going on, and if you do it right, you are serving people in amazingly great new ways and giving them stuff that they need, and you're not wasting their time, you're not wasting money getting that stuff to them, or you're wasting less money getting that stuff to them. But there are ways in which this, because so much data is being captured on us, things can go wrong. And things can go wrong in the design of the algorithms. Just humans bring their own sensibilities to the code they write to create those things. Things can go wrong because the data sets they're using have biases built into them. The things can go wrong just because people make lousy human judgments and stereotypical judgments as a heuristic, and that's baked into the data and the algorithms too. I'm a member of the panel, a panel that was created by the National Academy of Sciences and Technology to write a white paper that will come out in the next couple of months. You can see it online now because it's in draft form. But the purpose of it was to try to create a discipline, an undergraduate discipline called data science. And there was a really interesting, amazing, I was the stupidest person in the room by a lot. There were great people in the room. And there was an amazing discussion about not only the wisdom of that, how much different is the thing that we call data science from statistics, computer science, and maybe even math. And even if you could define those differences fairly clearly, the academic politics of it are brutal. Because why is the computer science department going to be happy with students who might otherwise end up there showing up in the new department of data science? Similarly, how are the statisticians, even more so, going to be happy with people ending up there? So there's that to do, but as we did our due diligence in this work, there are dozens of campuses that already now have data science programs. Sometimes they're majors, sometimes they're minors, sometimes they're sort of data science in the way that Elon is doing them as a major in a discipline. And so there are also a couple of dozen community colleges that are already starting certificate programs in data science. So one of the things that's going to happen soon enough is that all of those students at the college level who are trained as data scientists will go into firms and start performing some sort of analytics kinds of work. But if they're going to be pressured by the community college students who are going to be perfectly competent in doing sort of the basic level data analysis, data explanation, and stuff like that. And so there's just interesting ferment in the field that I wanted to warn you about, because you're not alone. Matter of fact, you're in a big crowd who are thinking about the degrees to which the academy is responding to all of these things that I'm talking about. And one of the most interesting exercises we went through was defining what data acumen is. And this isn't quite similar to what we're asking of the media analytics folks in this crowd, but they're wonderful sort of rich definitions of what you need to know, the literacies, the skill sets, and stuff like that go in there. And I just wanted to highlight that for you, because this is a big conversation. And maybe I'll, yeah, I might make this my final slide. How am I doing for time? Ooh, 4 minutes. This will be my last slide. I'm just going to underline what's already been said in other ways here, that the value-added roles in media analytics experts is going to be framing research questions. Because computer scientists are great at crunching the numbers, and statisticians are great about extracting some level of meaning out of them. But the core missing piece that actually I was arguing for in this Academy's report was research design itself. What questions are you trying to answer is not a sort of core skill that is centrally taught in those disciplines, and it can be in a data science discipline. So I think Don Draper with data. The other translation feature that media analytics folks are going to go through is with their own companies. You know, they're going to have to translate from the real data crunchers to their bosses, and at least explain the value of data to the people who are in decision-making levels. So the frames of study will be different. There will be a new measures of attention allocation that will eventually come out of this. One of the, and maybe this is a great way to end on a historic note. Amazingly enough, the universe arranged things so that the two great moments when advertising was being bigly disrupted were in the 1920s, right? The rise of mass media and stuff like that, which is at the moment that Freudian and Jungian psychology was in ascendance, and people were beginning to understand how minds worked and beginning to care a lot. So the rise of that cognitive expertise as well as messaging expertise was an amazingly powerful moment for the culture. We're now in the same thing. Right? We're now in a disruption that's probably even greater than the rise of mass media through all of this stuff. And we're in the moment where cognitive science is sort of marching alongside. We are inside people's brains now in new ways, gathering new insights about what makes them tick and why they do, what lights them up, what turns them off, what makes them furious and dangerous, what makes them affirming and loving. And so there are ways for you all to be speaking to each other, in part because you're going to have to keep learning from each other to do this stuff, and in part because this is what makes us human. Talking to each other communally, coordinating things communally, literally getting our message across communally is really the distinguishing thing between us and all the other beasts of the earth. So don't mess this up. You're in the middle of a big, important conversation, and you have really important ways to contribute to it. Thank you very much. Two questions. I'm so sorry. You know what? I'm a native New Yorker and a native Washingtonian now, and I'm just the worst speaker possible from both of those cultures. Too fast, too long, but we can do two questions. Any questions? Yeah.
Understandably, a lot of your data is very US-centric. But I wonder, when you think of these 6 new channels,
Yeah.
And how they translate to audiences outside of the US, do you have any data or know anyone who's collecting that sort of data?
The question is, do we know about other cultures in the attention and media zones that I was outlining? We don't. As a matter of fact, in some ways, that's my construct for it that is not enshrined in anything other than my PowerPoint slides. And I think, you know, it's always the case that even compared with Europe and advanced Asia, certainly Japan, Australia, and now big chunks of China, we're always ahead by at least a couple of years. And so smartphone penetration is going to be the big driver of a bunch of those zones, and it'll be interesting to see whether other cultures do them the same way. Part of the potential uniqueness of America is that we have this incredibly rich diversity of media content and ideas, and these might be particular to those circumstances where in more authoritarian or top-down or hierarchical kinds of societies, that diversity won't show up in, you know, snacking and social diving in the way that it does in America. Yeah.
Yeah, lead question about prevalence of video and social media. What are the trends you see about producing posts having video included?
Yeah, the question is about adding video to social media and their kissing cousins. And it's been interesting to watch how YouTube widely encourages that. And so it's in a way, pictures of all kinds, both stills and videos, are a much more powerful social currency now than text in some ways. And we're still trying to figure out the right rhythms of it and the right exposure to it. So, you know, there used to be these rules that don't do a video over 2 minutes if you want anybody to pay attention, stuff like that. I'm not sure that that's true anymore. We're producing these little videos now that are getting some nice traction about methodology. You know, just the most powerful viral subject you could ever imagine. And at 4 or 5 minutes, people are hanging with us. So it obviously depends on the subject and stuff like that. The other part of the video story is that you can just see pressure being applied to YouTube to fix its recommender system, because the algorithm is just it's taking you to places that aren't logical, you know, knowing where you started. So in politics, there's just a lot of concern, and there's actually an algorithm writer at YouTube who basically says it was structured to take you from reasonable to wacko zone relatively quickly. But there's evidence that you know, keeps people engaged. So yay for that. Thank you so much.